Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special GZERO media live stream sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. I'm Judy Woodruff with the PBS NewsHour and also a board member of the Carnegie Corporation. The title of our program today is Far Away and Close to Home, How U.S. Foreign Policy Impacts All Americans. And the timing couldn't be any better. Given that President Biden is continuing his trip in Europe this week. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, we're going to be talking about what America's policies globally mean for jobs, the economy, and the future of this country. We're going to be discussing trade and immigration and how domestic issues like racism and the deep partisan divides impact America's standing in the world. But to get us started today, I want to introduce to you and welcome the former governor of New Jersey, Tom Kean, who is chairman of the Carnegie Corporation of New York.
As chairman of Carnegie Corporation of New York's Board of Trustees, I want to thank the organizers, the panelists, and the participants for joining in today's forum on how U.S. foreign policy impacts all Americans, priorities and objectives, be they trade, immigration, or the U.S. global standing. This event, co-sponsored by the corporation and Eurasia's group GZERO, could not have come more opportunistic moment. On a national and global scale, the pandemic has been a time of introspection, contemplation, and deliberation. In the United States in particular, there's been a critical, creative, and contentious period, one that's led us as a nation to question who we are and where we're going. At the same time, the rest of the world is looking for us for a new leadership. This past year has been marked by a tremendous sense of loss, from which our corporation has not escaped unscathed. We lost our president, Vartan Gregorian, in April. Vartan's clear vision, unquestionable integrity, and genial courtesy guided our corporation for over 24 years. During his remarkable tenure, he championed our grant-making work and strengthening democracy and international relations. His belief in the importance of working with other institutions to achieve common goals led our corporation's international program to partner with the Eurasia Group to bring greater public attention to the interconnectedness of U.S. domestic and foreign policy. Throughout his time at the corporation, Vartan built bridges of trust and respect between institutions to advance the common good, which is why I think today he'd be very pleased at today's agenda and the exceptional individuals on our expert panels. And by the way, he also would have been honored to see that another corporation trustee, Judy Woodruff, the best newscaster in the country, in my belief, has agreed to moderate today's discussion. Judy, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing from our expert panels. And once again, I want to thank Ian Bremmer, a longtime friend of Vartan's and a friend also of the corporations, for helping us spotlight a discussion that is so critical to the future of our nation and to our world at large.
And thank you, Governor Kean. Thank you, of course, for those very kind remarks. We appreciate your getting us started with this important conversation. And now I want to introduce our co-host for the program. As you just heard, Ian Bremmer is the president of the Eurasia Group. We're so glad to have Ian here. And he's, of course, president also of GZERO Media. And Donna Edwards, a former member of Congress, a Democrat who served in Maryland's 4th District from 2008 to 2017. And we welcome both of you and look forward to hearing from you. Before we begin, I just want to say what a great friend and mentor Vartan Gregorian was to me as well. He was one of the truly magnificent human beings of our time, a towering intellect, bottomless curiosity, infinitely generous, generously caring about others, a man who left the world a far better place than he found it. Ian, you knew him very well.
Certainly did. It kills me that when we were talking about putting this program together, it was, of course, when he was still very much a part of it. And, I really miss the fact that we are going to be talking today about starting to turn this ship around, starting to provide more leadership, something that he devoted his entire life to. And we can only talk about it today in legacy. But I certainly hope that he'd be smiling if he was watching us right now.
I know that he would be. So we are going to dive into some of those issues that we mentioned at the top of the program. But I want to first actually come back to you, Ian, because as we said, President Biden still in Europe on a week-long trip. He's in the final 2 days for the G7, for the NATO meetings, the European Union, and of course, tomorrow, the meetings meeting with President Putin. Tell us what so far stands out for you.
You know, especially since we're talking about Vartan, maybe I should say what stands out in a most optimistic way. And that is that in this year and a half of coronavirus, the worst crisis that I've experienced in my lifetime, we've actually seen now the United States announce that we are going to donate 500 million vaccines, donate to lower income countries around the world, with American allies in the G7 committing to donate and match us another $500 million. And I have not seen a single note of dissent from any political figure in the United States, Democrat or Republican, from US global leadership on this issue. And Judy, I can't think of another issue in foreign policy that has been completely unpoliticized. It's nice to see that the single largest thing that's come out of coronavirus, finally, too late, too little, but nonetheless, it's going to have more impact than any other action that's being taken over the last week and a half, is one that Americans can actually rally behind. There have been some other things that have happened. We're moving towards a global minimum tax, alternative tax for corporations that it's going to take many years to put in place, but we're starting to steer the ship. You certainly saw some cooperation and collaboration on things like coal, and trying to reduce the use of coal and investment in coal around the world. That was promising. The Japanese made a historic move. You saw more of the US and its allies in terms of responding to Russia on cyber attacks, responding to China, trying to develop some infrastructure investment and financing. But the big headline move has to be about how we're responding to this crisis. And for the last week and a half, we finally have some truly positive news.
And you're right. So far, no politicization of that. But of course, at the other end, very much politicization of the argument over where it all started. But that's a different subject of conversation. Donna, we did hear President Biden back several months ago speak about his foreign policy goals. And I'm going to quote here. He said, "There's no longer a bright line between foreign and domestic policy. Every action we take in our conduct abroad, we must take with American working families in mind." So that sounds good, but Donna, what does it mean in practice?
Well, I think it was actually a really important statement. And jumping off from where Ian started with the pandemic, one of the reasons that the president was able to make this really strong international commitment on the COVID vaccine is precisely because he had handled it well here at home. And that opened the space to be able to say, we're doing what we need to do at home, and now let's do what we need to do for the world, because that is really important to us. And so I always found, as a member of Congress, the most difficult thing was to try to focus on international policy and connect that to concerns at home. And so many members of Congress, frankly, don't have those kind of strong inclinations or connections. And it's almost as though they leave Washington and foreign policy is divorced from their work. And so I think the president rightfully is saying, what we need to do is connect these concerns because they are, and they are global in nature. What happens in our economy certainly impacts the rest of the world and vice versa. And I think in that way, you begin to build the kind of consensus in the country that's actually going to be needed for the president to operate on the world stage, but also to move the United States.
So with all that in mind, we want to turn to what we're calling the interactive part of our program right now. We want to get you and the audience engaged. We're going to pose some questions to you who are watching to get your take on the issues. If you're on GZERO's site right now, you're going to see a chat window to the right of the video screen on a desktop, or if you're on a mobile device, it's going to be below. I want you to sign in there, and that's how you cast your vote on this question, which I'm going to read right now. And it is, which of these issues matter most to you when it comes to U.S. foreign policy? And the choices are 1, national security, 2, trade, 3, immigration, and 4, America's standing globally. So there they are again: 1, national security, 2, trade, 3, immigration, or 4, America's standing globally. If you'll submit your vote in just a few minutes, we're going to tell everybody what the answers were. But in the meantime, Ian, it's hard to talk about any global issues right now without, as you've just done, acknowledging the pandemic, but also talking about how different countries have reacted, and how not only reacted initially, but how they've recovered in different ways. What impact do you see the global response having on America and America's ability to get done what it needs to do?
Well, I think we've got very lucky with the timing. I mean, in terms of the G7 summit that we just saw, the United States mostly, thankfully, looking at coronavirus through the rearview mirror right now. A G7 summit 3 months ago, you wouldn't have seen any progress on these issues, because the political realities of doing anything that wasn't focused 100% on the American public would have made it absolutely impossible. The Europeans, the Canadians, just a little bit behind the United States right now. Japan is starting to turn the corner. They're in tougher shape. Of course, if you're in the developing world, leaving aside China, you're in the developing world, you are in the thick of this. We have more deaths right now for coronavirus so far in the first half of this year than we've had in the entirety of 2020. And that's overwhelmingly in the poorer income countries. We need to play a role, because otherwise the global economic response, the ability to travel, the remittances that they send back to their family members, all of that is going to get crushed at a time when inflation is increasing, and the ability of these countries that are increasingly indebted to secure credit is going to be very challenged indeed. So, I mean, it may end up that we're doing too little too late, but if it had been 6 or 12 months later, I think you would have already seen some financial crashes in some of these developing markets. That's what we have to really watch out for, guard against over the course of the coming year.
You're saying it could get much worse.
I think when I look at a country like Turkey right now, and Biden just met with the Turkish president in the last 24 hours, but nothing really happened there. There's no substance. Their economy is in deep, deep trouble. There's massive amounts of capital flight. They've had a hard time responding to coronavirus. The contraction of the economy is real. It's being faced largely on the backs of working class and middle class Turks. Erdogan's party is at record lows as a consequence. There are a lot of countries out there that are in Latin America, for example, that are experiencing what Turkey is experiencing right now. Clearly, while the U.S. is starting to feel like we have an enormously robust expansion, so much so that there's going to be a big debate over, whether or not we want to do more deficit spending in terms of a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure package. That's going to be our concern. Oh, the countries like Turkey, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Chile, they don't have anywhere near that kind of luxury. I think there's a lot of vulnerability in those countries in the coming year. Absolutely.
So, and Donna, as we're hearing Ian speak about inequity on the global scale, this pandemic, as we know, has so opened up and reminded us again of inequities in the United States.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, if you look at the impact of the now 600,000 people who've lost their lives in this pandemic in the United States, so many of them Black and brown, lower income, who didn't have the access to health care before the pandemic and certainly were vulnerable during the pandemic. Well, that's magnified on a global stage. If you look at the countries that have so many of these tremendous impacts, in fact, they are Black and brown countries on the continent, on the African continent, throughout Latin America, in communities in Europe that are immigrant communities, low-income communities. You see these same kind of inequities, both in death from COVID, lack of job opportunities, and of course, in their receipt of health care. And so I think this is a really tremendous problem for the United States. It's not that we can get everything going here in the United States. Well, if we do that and the rest of the world is sinking, then eventually that's going to catch up with what we have now, which is a growing economy. So we can't really separate these problems. And I think that's why the president is acting in a way that says, you know what happens in the United States, he's saying this to Americans, we can't just sit in our little bubble. We have to be concerned about the rest of the world.
Well, we can now, picking up on what both Ian and Donna have been saying, we can give you, share with you what the poll results are at this moment. National security came in with the largest percentage at 38%. After that, America standing in the world at 31%, immigration at 17%, and finally, trade at 11%. Ian, do you want to react to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that trade is lower, in part because you don't have the United States leadership pushing significant new multilateral free trade deals. There's been a lot of sense of, focusing on buying American. I think that most Americans feel like whether it's Democrats or Republicans, their voices are being heard on those issues. And the negotiations that the Trump administration had, with the South Koreans, with the Europeans, with the new NAFTA and the Biden administration as well, I kind of feel like that's pretty aligned. Where on issues like national security, we've seen the massive ransomware attacks. We've seen much greater concerns about US versus China. Broadly speaking, that's a national security issue. And so I'm not surprised that that's where the population is coming out.
Donna, does any of this result surprise you?
Well, it doesn't really. And I think especially because when most people think of foreign policy, they think of national security. But I want to go to the ground because I can remember times as a member of Congress, when you talk to people in communities, they have more concerns about things like trade and the impact on their jobs, on immigration. And, they're either concerns about immigration or willingness to open immigration so that we can make sure that we have, a strong workforce. So these results don't surprise me, but I wonder what results might be if you just walk through communities.
A good reminder and an important reminder. So we are going to turn right now. We're going to briefly let Donna and Ian step aside, if you will, while we introduce another guest we are having today. She is Miriam Shapiro, and she is served as both deputy and acting trade representative during the Obama administration. Ambassador Sapiro, very good to see you. Thank you so much for being with us. We just saw trade come in last in that audience survey, but we know, as Donna's just pointing out, and Ian, it matters very much to the well-being of this country. But I want to, as I come to you with our first question, I'm looking at a Pew poll from earlier this year that found 75% of American adults see protecting the jobs of American workers as their top foreign policy priority. So talk for a moment about how you see jobs, trade, and foreign policy coming together.
It's great to be here, Judy. And I was almost wishing when we ran that poll a few minutes ago that we could have had another answer, which was all of the above, because these issues are so intertwined. And I think the Pew poll really, really shows that. And I would say it's because even pre-pandemic, if we can remember that far back, there was growing concern across the country that politicians in Washington were just too focused on other issues and not on the needs of American workers and their families. And as we know, globalization has led to great economic growth in the US, but these benefits have not been widely distributed, as Don alluded to. They have disproportionately helped those at the top, the largest companies and the wealthiest Americans, and thereby increased economic inequality. And over the years, the US has also failed to adequately help workers whose jobs were displaced by advances in technology like automation or by offshoring and outsourcing. And then when the pandemic hit, it exacerbated this economic dislocation. We saw millions of Americans living precariously, losing jobs, relying on food banks to survive. And the suffering was even more pronounced in Black and Latino communities. So I think this whole situation really drove home the fact that a critical aspect of US national security is actually our economic security, defined broadly, no longer just in terms of America's GDP or America's exports, but also I think defined by the level of economic insecurity that families across the country have been facing. So while fortunately the US is starting to recover, as Ian said, other countries are not, they're still sort of right in the eye of the pandemic. We need to be smart about how we rebuild. And we really do need to make those long overdue investments that can strengthen the middle class and strengthen our ability to compete and to win, whether it's infrastructure, both digital and hard, whether it's R&D, whether it's creating more green jobs and a greener economy, whether it's focusing on STEM and other kinds of education and training that we really need, whether it's supply chain resiliency, a lot of things that need to come together so that we can work with trusted partners and not have to worry again about whether we'll have enough chips for our computers, enough PPE to protect our healthcare workers. So I think it's both logical and vital that our foreign policy is seeking to advance both our national security and our economic security by focusing more on helping American workers succeed.
And I was just, in fact, I'm glad you've been saying this, because I was just going to be asking you, what does a trade policy that serves American workers look like? And that's what you're addressing. But I do want to turn quickly to China, because the Economic Policy Institute has reported that from 2001 to 2018, so the bulk of the last 2 decades, America's trade deficit with China led to the loss of almost 4 million jobs. The vast majority were in manufacturing. What is to be done about that?
Well, China does remain our largest trade deficit, but we also have to keep in mind that the US runs a trade deficit with many countries, and that there are a number of reasons for this. A key reason, at least prior to the pandemic, is that we were largely a nation of consumers, not savers, meaning that we would buy much more than we sell, and not just from China. On the good news side, though, we run a surplus in services where we export many more services to the rest of the world than we import. But our biggest problem really with China is not the deficit per se, especially since economists find it often hard to tie deficits to unemployment. And given that we run our own trade surpluses with a number of countries like the UK, for example, the Netherlands, Australia. But the real problem is that China refuses to play fairly or by the rules. And as we've seen over the last few days while the president's in Europe, it's not just the US that has had enough. We have seen our European partners and our partners in Asia stepping up as well. So working together, we will have more leverage to hold China and other countries accountable for unfair trade practices, whether it's violations of labor rights, whether it's illegal subsidies, whether it's forced tech transfers, or whether it's the theft of intellectual property, all of which harm workers and run counter to our shared values with our partners and allies.
I want to ask you, Ambassador Sapiro, about a contrast, if you will, between President Biden and his predecessor. We know former President Trump was all about America first, and in many cases, he was saying America only. But I think the question can be asked, since President Biden came in talking about America first as a policy. He had Made in America as an executive order in the first few days he was president. How are the two administrations different when it comes to trade policy and jobs?
Well, let's first talk about America first. I have spent many years negotiating with foreign governments on behalf of the United States on agreements ranging from peace treaties to human rights treaties to military agreements to trade and investment agreements and beyond. I have to tell you, every country puts its own interests first. Otherwise, its negotiators would need to look for new jobs and quickly. But putting your own country's interests first does not mean not working with the other governments towards a win-win scenario that will achieve US goals. So back to trade. While there's a common focus on reshoring American jobs, especially manufacturing jobs, the approaches of President Trump and President Biden couldn't be more different. If you think about Trump's America First vision, it was very much my way or the highway. And he frequently alienated allies and undermined the very international organizations that the US depends on. And Trump also had the view that trade wars are, quote, good and easy to win. Well, we now know, thanks to Moody's and other studies that have been done, that US importers absorbed more than 90% of the costs of the trade war with China. And that increased prices for US consumers and farmers, and it actually hurt US jobs. So I think the second distinction is that President Biden knows better than anyone that the US is stronger and can accomplish much more by leading and working in partnership with other countries. I think China is a great example, which we just discussed, of why precisely that approach is threatening to countries that don't play by the rules, that don't have many allies, and that think they can get away with doing what they please without repercussions. Just think about China. What allies does China have to fall back on? Possibly North Korea, and maybe, depending on the day, Russia. The US, in contrast, under President Biden, is making the most of our alliances and our strong partnerships, not just this week at the G7 and NATO and the EU, but also with respect to the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. So I think the two approaches differ a lot in terms of the goals, the approach, but also the substance. President Biden actually has a plan for making the badly needed infrastructure improvements that we discussed a moment ago, for incentivizing more US manufacturing, and for actually cutting back on the exceptions that have gutted the rules that otherwise require government authorities here to buy from American companies. And I would say, last but certainly not least, and perhaps most importantly, President Biden is really focused intensely on the plight of American workers and not on helping those at the top who are doing just fine.
And just before I let you go on the former president and his trade policy, one aspect of that, of course, was higher tariffs.
Yeah.
How do you see those, either the pros or the cons of higher tariffs as they leave the United States in 2021 and beyond?
Yeah. The targeted use of tariffs can definitely be the right tool to fight unfair trade practices that put domestic industry at risk. They can also be imposed as permitted retaliation for illegal trade practices. Take, for example, the Boeing Airbus dispute that's in the news today. It's been litigated for nearly 2 decades, and finally a truce was reached. So that's the kind of tariff that's imposed when there's a dispute and one, or in this case, both sides won some relief. But I would say tariffs are rarely a long-term solution, especially when US consumers bear the brunt of the costs, either because the foreign countries are imposing the tariffs or the US is doing that, and then the foreign countries retaliating against the US. And when we look at the China tariffs that Trump imposed, as I noted a moment ago, they've caused significant harm to US farmers and consumers. But at the same time, these tariffs are the ammunition of trade wars. And so the US is unlikely to drop tariffs until, in this case, it sees changes in China's behavior, because to do otherwise would mean that the costs were imposed for nothing, and that would be a double loss.
Ambassador Sapiro, thank you very much for being part of this conversation. We appreciate it so much. And but actually, before I let you go, I want to just quickly turn to Ian and Donna to get their takes on this. Ian, you've given President Trump credit for some of his foreign policy moves. What about when it comes to China or to China trade? What about when it comes to what used to be called NAFTA, now USMCA? How do you size up the pluses and minuses at this stage?
Yeah, the fact that Trump was more unilateralist and more transactionalist definitely meant that implementation was rocky, but it didn't mean that there weren't any successes. And you mentioned a couple. The new NAFTA is a small but meaningful improvement on the old deal, and it was done under the Trump administration. So I'm not going to demonize him for that. But I do think that on China specifically, we do need to understand that the most significant piece of new multilateral architecture that would have aligned more deeply the U.S. with its core allies on trade would have been a big strategic win was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Obama administration tried to get done. They failed. The Trump administration killed it. America's allies put it together without the U.S. They would still love the U.S. to come back into that agreement. Biden's not going to do it. He's not going to do it because there isn't enough support in the United States among his core constituents or in Congress to sign a big new multilateral trade deal. That's a problem. I mean, it's very hard to have a trade policy for a middle class when a lot of Americans feel like they're no longer middle class, and that trade policy doesn't help them, even though most jobs today aren't going away because of free trade. They're going away because of technology, and they're not going to come back just because you're going to necessarily have capital come back. Policy needs to address that. Final point for me on this is that on China specifically, it is absolutely true, as the ambassador says, that the United States needs the strength of its alliances to coordinate policy vis-a-vis China. That is the strength. It is the fact that we can have similar attachment and support for a rules-based global trade system. But there's a very big problem here. And that's that when we say the era of engagement with China is over, our corporates don't agree. I mean, LeBron James and Elon Musk and John Cena and David Solomon and Larry Fink, I mean, they're all looking to do a lot more in China, even though there's no rule of law. And that's because they see a massive market opportunity. The Chinese don't have allies, but they do have control of their top corporate players. The United States has allies, but we have no patriotism in terms of our top corporate and business players. And that misalignment is going to be where you see so much of the confrontation going forward.
And Donna, bring it to American workers. I mean, from their perspective, does U.S. trade policy need some serious reform, or is there just a misunderstanding of how it works and what it means for them?
For so many American workers, the challenge is that the perception is their reality. We're only a generation away from southern states who had robust textile markets, and those workers lost their jobs to trade. And so their perception is, yes, my job was lost to trade. To auto workers who saw a dislocation in the auto industry. And so there are so many communities. U.S. Steel is another example where President Biden has really made very clear that he is going to protect U.S. Steel and those steel workers, because that is a loss that's attributed to trade. And so I think it, while the numbers may bear out differently, the perception of this generation and the generation just prior is that an awful lot of their jobs were lost to trade. And so they remember that viscerally. Their families have changed significantly. They went from being, sort of on the bottom end of middle class and middle class to struggling in minimum wage jobs. So I think that President Biden has a really difficult balance to strike when it comes to trade, both protecting American workers, but also working with our allies and partners. And I think coming out of the G7, NATO, and EU, what you do see is at least more of a united front when it comes to democracies and challenging these autocracies, which of course can get away with imposing ideas and values on their workers that the West simply cannot do. So this is a real challenge, but you're not going to get it by having an argument with the American worker about whether they lost their job to trade or technology.
All right, Donna, thank you for this moment. Ian, thank you. And a special thanks to Ambassador Miriam Shapiro for joining us. We appreciate it. And now we're going to leave that and move on to another important subject, one we asked about a moment ago, and that's immigration. America is home to more immigrants than any other country on the planet. And the vast majority, more than 75%, are here legally. But in recent years, much of the attention around this issue has been focused, as we know, on the southern border and migrants coming in from Mexico and from Central America. Ian, let's start with what's been going on just in the past few weeks. Vice President Kamala Harris made her first international trip to Mexico and to Central America. She told the president of Mexico, López Obrador, and I'm quoting, "We are embarking on a new era." Does it seem that way when you look at what's happening at the border?
The numbers are going up. From that perspective, I guess it's a new era. This is going to be hard for Kamala to work. We know that immigration is, the toughest issue out there in foreign policy. It's immensely polarized. I mean, people on both sides understand where the cooperation needs to be, and it's just impossible from a legal perspective. And so there's not that much for the Americans to go and offer to the Mexican government, particularly to the governments of the Northern Triangle. And here, I mean, Kamala made her first trip to Guatemala, which is the one government that has at least some alignment with the United States, has some rule of law. Honduras right now, El Salvador right now. I mean, these are countries that are desperately poor, that really don't have effective rule of law, and that the Americans can offer carrots, but it's not likely to be successful given the nature of their government. So, I mean, really, one would expect that this is going to continue to be a very, very tough nut for the vice president to lead and crack.
And speaking of that, Donna Edwards, the vice president was criticized by some for not going to the border itself on this first trip. What do you think about that?
Well, I thought it was a little bit of a ridiculous critique. The vice president has, before she was vice president, she represented California. She spent a lot of time on the border. She did the same thing when as she was campaigning. But I think that the bigger question is how the vice president is going to navigate both what needs to happen in terms of controlling the border and the larger question of trying to make some progress on immigration and on reform in the Congress, which, it's hard to see how that can happen right now. And I know that the administration, the president and vice president, want to refocus their strategy around the Northern Triangle countries. But I think, as Ian said, you have to have a government to work with, and one that's not corrupt, so that the money that you put in actually gets on the ground and into community-based organizations and into providing opportunity. And it's really not clear yet how that can happen.
Such a tough one. All right, before we move ahead and introduce our next guest, I'm going to come back to you, the audience, with another question for you. And as a reminder, you can vote by signing onto or into the chat box, excuse me, to the right of the video screen if you're on a desktop, or it's below the player if you are on a mobile device. Here's the question. Do you believe the US government can reach a bipartisan agreement on immigration reform in the next 4 years? A is yes and B is no. It's pretty straightforward. A is yes and B is no. Can the US reach a bipartisan agreement on immigration reform during the Biden term? So we're going to reveal what the answers were in just a moment. But right now, let's bring in our next guest. She's Cecilia Munoz, senior advisor to the organization New America. She has spent decades working not only on immigration, but also on Latino civil rights issues. And there you are, Cecilia. Very good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. There's so many things to talk about here. It's hard to know where to begin, but let me just begin by saying, you've worked, as we said, in the Obama administration, you worked with the Obama-Harris transition team. So far, how is this new administration doing on this issue?
Well, they've been faced with challenges from the very first moment. It is not an easy thing to have a difficult situation at the border, which the previous administration contributed so much to on Inauguration Day. So it took them a minute to get the amount of shelter space available, for example, for the large numbers of unaccompanied migrant children. And President Biden, of course, made a number of substantial campaign commitments in this space. And by and large, they're making good on those commitments. It's not easy work. I know this from experience. But it's important that it be based on values. It's important that it be based on our humanity, and it's important that it be based on the rule of law. And the Biden administration is making progress on all of those fronts, understanding that this is a tremendously challenging situation. And as you noted, it is also tremendously politicized. It's hard enough to manage a challenge at the border all by itself without the kind of spotlight and the kind of yelling that it invariably provokes.
It's hard to think of a more difficult issue facing the Biden administration, but take us a little bit deeper into it. So many people look at this and they say, throw up their hands. It's a crisis. What are we going to do? How do you see what is going on? What is driving the surge of people to the border? I know that there's a lot of conversation about, well, it's President Biden hasn't sent the tough signal that former President Trump did, but what's driving it? And how do you see it? Where do you see it going?
Yeah. The most important thing I can say is that the tough signals that we do or don't send at the border is not what's driving it. If the last 4 years have taught us anything, it's that we can be as tough as we can imagine. I mean, the last administration took people's children away from them in the hope that would deter people from coming, and it didn't deter people from coming. So that tells you that the decisions we make around the border are not affecting what's driving migration. What's affecting migration is what's happening in the Northern Triangle countries to a degree. And I worked in the Obama administration where we faced a substantial unexpected upsurge in migrants, especially unaccompanied children in 2014. Some of this is longstanding problems in the region. Some of it has to do with violence, gang violence, drug-related violence in the region. Some of it has to do with climate. Honduras had 2 hurricanes in the same region within the course of 2 weeks last year. Some of those communities are still underwater. And Guatemala is in an epic drought and suffered failure of the coffee crop. So there's a climate aspect to the migration that's happening. And the thing that is, I think, most important to understand is that we have a refugee crisis in our hemisphere. That's what this is. And we will never fix a refugee crisis in our hemisphere with the measures that we take at the border. So the administration's job is to manage the border situation, following the law and hopefully following our values, while also taking steps to address the reasons that people are migrating in the first place, which is not a short-term fix, but which is essential if we're going to get our arms around this problem, because we can't fix it at the border.
Such a tough message to hear, but I want to say our audience, those of us who are joining us today, are pretty pessimistic. I'm going to read the results of that instant poll, if you will. What percentage think there will be a bipartisan agreement on immigration in the next 4 years? Yes, 27%. No, 73%. So almost 3 to 1. People are saying they don't think. So Cecilia, you can react to that, but I also want to ask you, building on what you were just saying about how tough this is. People look at this, of course, as the impact on American jobs. They also look at it as a national security problem. How do you see the national security piece of it?
Well, there is absolutely a security element to all of this. It is reasonable for the American public to expect that the government will maintain the integrity of our borders. That is precisely the reason that we need Congress to step up and pass an immigration reform. And while I am not surprised by the pessimism of your viewers, what's interesting is that the question was about whether or not the Congress has the capacity to do this. And there's plenty of reason for doubt given where we've been over the last 20 years and the multiple attempts to get this done. But that's actually not where the American public is. Upwards of 85% of the public supports an immigration reform along the lines of what President Biden has introduced, along the lines of the bill that passed the US Senate in the Obama administration by 68 votes in the Senate. That was a bipartisan vehicle, and there is bipartisan support in the country for the kinds of reforms that are being put forward. The problem is not with the consensus in the United States. The problem is with the consensus in the Congress, and that's where we run into trouble. And it's tremendously unfortunate. The legal immigration system hasn't been updated since 1990. And think about that. Like, this was before, email was kind of a new thing. Google was not yet a thing. That's the last time we've updated our immigration laws. Our immigration laws are badly out of date, badly in need of reform. And to get back to the national security aspect of your question, we are not well positioned to manage the security elements of this, the workforce elements of this issue, until we actually get our laws up to date. And what we learned, in fact, a study came out just this week, that if we address the undocumented population living within the United States, 10 to 11 million people who have been here on an average of 16 years, it contributes something of the nature of $1.7 trillion with a T to our GDP. So the economic benefits of reforming the law are vast. The benefits to the workforce of reforming the law are vast. But Congress doesn't want to do it really because we have a roadblock on the Republican side. That's the truth of the matter.
And speaking of Republican arguments against it, as you know very well, one of their main arguments is, if we let these undocumented in, they will take jobs that Americans should have. What's the truth?
The truth of that is that actually the opposite is true. First of all, the question isn't about letting undocumented people in, right? The question is about whether people who have been living here and working here for the long term, an average of 16 years, should be given an opportunity to get on the right side of the law. Those folks are already in our workforce, and what the economic evidence shows, and there's really largely a consensus on this from folks who study it, is that they have the impact of creating jobs and expanding the economy for everybody else. Everywhere from the tech companies that have been started by folks who are immigrants, to the essential workers who have frankly kept us all alive and with food on our tables during this pandemic that we are all hopefully coming out of. In some ways, it's a little bit clearer how much we depend on the immigrant workforce, including the undocumented workforce, and frankly, how much we all benefit if we give them an opportunity to get on the right side of the law.
Well, in connection with that, I want to bring back in Ian and Donna, and Ian, ask it from a slightly different direction. The Cato Institute has reported that deporting the 750,000 people protected by DACA, of course, that's the young people who came as children, deferred action for childhood arrivals. Their finding was that would create a $280 billion reduction in U.S. economic growth. So the question is there an argument to be made about immigration and American competitiveness?
We know that this country has been built on the back of immigrants. And we also know that immigrants have taken so many of the jobs that people living in the United States for a long time have been unwilling to do at those rates, some of the most difficult, some of the most dangerous, and work really hard at it. We also know that criminality rates among first-generation immigrants coming in are actually considerably lower than those of the population that's been around for a long time. But the problem is that this country is incredibly divided. This is the US right now is by far the most politically divided of the G7 economies, the most economically divided of the G7 economies. And that means that these arguments become completely weaponized. I mean, if you're a Democrat and you think the Republican is not just the political opponent, but the enemy, if you're a Republican, you think the Democrat is the enemy, think of how you're going to feel about undocumented immigrants in that environment, in this media and social environment. It gets so toxic. And so Cecilia is completely right on two core issues. One, this doesn't just get resolved at the border. It's a much more holistic and deeper issue. And secondly, that the population has to be able to come together in a political way, that the problem is not with the average American, it's that the extremes of the United States are becoming so much more weaponized. It's not like the average American is engaging in all of these, anti-Asian attacks, anti-Semitic attacks, racial violence in the US, which is going up. but we see it, and it becomes much more weaponized in this environment. That civic discourse has to be a part of the solution.
So Donna, while we're hearing all the reasons for why it is so hard to come up with any sort of agreement on this, what would it take? What would it take to realize a serious compromise on immigration policy in the Congress?
Yeah, as Cecilia knows, I think in the early part of the 2000s, there was a lot more consensus. I remember as a member of Congress coming in and having really tough conversations in a majority African-American congressional district about immigration and trying to allay some of the concerns and debunk the myths that were being spread about immigration. And these communities moved. And so that is why, as Cecilia describes, there is widespread support in the public. I mean, the President Biden talks all the time about bipartisanship in the country versus bipartisanship in the Congress. And there was strong support for a comprehensive bill that passed out of the Senate. There was support in the House, and two House speakers, Republican speakers, refused to bring it to the floor. And so that brings us to today, where I think, some of the rhetoric has changed on the extremes, but I don't think the country has changed. And I think people recognize that some of the challenges that we are facing at the border need a real solution, a legislative solution in the Congress. Frankly, right now, I think our Congress is going to have to change, and that is going to come through an electoral solution to be able to develop that kind of consensus again that matches the consensus in the country.
So, Cecilia, whether it's this Congress or a future slightly different looking Congress, what does a realistic immigration reform proposal look like? Something that could actually get passed?
What's so interesting is that the policy part is actually not the hard part. It's right. It's the political part. It's the weaponization of the issue to ignite a minority, frankly, among Republicans. So the elements of an immigration reform are a reasonable process to help undocumented folks get on the legal side of the line. That requires things like paying taxes and learning English and all of the things that have been in immigration reform proposals for the last 20 years. An updating of the legal immigration system so that families, Americans, don't wait in terrible long lines to reunite with their closest family members. And opportunities for the people who come to study at our world-class universities and study in technological fields and then have to leave and go work somewhere else because we don't have visas available for them. Updates to that system so that we create legal pathways for the folks who want to work here and who we would all benefit from if they participate in our economy. Like those three elements, I would add reforms to our asylum system if that's the system which is so under challenge right now at the border. I mean, what we're facing at the border is not a problem of undocumented migration. It's a problem of asylum applicants and an asylum system which has not been updated in many decades and which is not equal to the task that we're facing. Those are the elements of reform. Frankly, substantively, they're not hard. What's hard is getting members of Congress to work in a bipartisan way to get to 60 votes. As Donna mentioned, we've had bills pass the Senate a couple of times in a bipartisan way in the last 20 years, but we could not get a Speaker of the House to bring it to the floor in a Republican Congress. That's why we haven't had immigration reform. And that the result is that we have people weaponizing the issue for political gain who frankly don't have a political interest in reforming the system because they would rather lift up the challenges and beat people over the head with them, frankly.
Well, it speaks volumes about just how divided we are as a country. And we see it right here in Washington. I just want to share this interesting fact that I was given as we end this segment. There was a report in 2019 that found that 45% almost half of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or children of immigrants. And of course, on that list, Amazon, Apple, Tesla, and we could go on, but that's pretty striking. So Cecilia Munoz, thank you so much for joining us. Very good to see you. We appreciate it. And Ian, you and Donna are going to stay with us, but we're going to make a transition now.
The United States is back, and democracies of the world are standing together to tackle the toughest challenges and the issues that matter most to our future. That we're committed to leading with strength, defending our values, and delivering for our people.
And of course, that was President Biden speaking just a few days ago in the United Kingdom when he arrived for his European trip. In advance, he was speaking in advance of the G7 summit. But the message he was trying to get across was clear. Under his leadership, he's saying America is recommitting to the traditional alliances that many Americans wondered about under the leadership of former President Trump. So in our final conversation today, we want to talk about the challenges that lie ahead for the United States, both foreign and domestic. And I want to bring in a good friend of all of ours, Anne-Marie Slaughter. She's CEO of New America and former policy planning director at the United States State Department. Anne-Marie, welcome. It's very good to see you again. Thank you for making time to be with us. But let's start with this phrase that we're hearing from President Biden, and that is, America is back. What does that really mean?
So Judy, it's great to be here. And I do have to just begin by saying how honored I am to be part of this in memory of Vartan Gregorian, who was a force in my life as well as an academic who then led nonprofits and just an inspiration and another fantastic immigrant, as long as we've been on that subject. So America is back. Well, in one way, it's very clear. It means America is back as a multilateral player. America is back as the country that set up the existing multilateral system with its allies, certainly with Great Britain and others, and who has certainly had isolationist turns or unilateral turns since the 1940s. But overall, we have been a pillar of this system. We have been willing to make the side payments and exercise leadership necessary to make the system work when it has worked. Donald Trump was absolutely determined not to work within that system. Indeed, I think he would have preferred a kind of 19th century concert of great powers, shifting concert based entirely on interest. And Biden is a committed multilateralist. So that's really what he means when he says we're back. And then he also wants to say we are back upholding democratic values. We are back to lead the open societies, the democracies of the world against the autocracies. I think that interpretation is a little more problematic.
And of course, what President Biden is saying is against the backdrop of what Americans heard from, what the world heard from former President Trump for 4 years, which is America first, America preeminent, predominant, exceptional America. And for many Americans, that resonates with them. There have been a number of wars Americans have been involved in. Not all of them have ended in the way the United States wanted them to. People are tired of, some people don't understand why America continues to give money to other countries. Has President Biden, Anne-Marie, been able, or is he making successfully the argument that there is a reason for the United States to be engaged and to stay engaged in the world?
I think he is. I think indeed the election of President Biden was in part a rejection of his turning his back on the world and stiffing allies in extraordinarily rude ways. Obviously, his supporters took on America first, but I think the majority of the country did not. And watching us simply lose ground in the world, not only because of what Trump said, but also, frankly, it was his handling of the COVID pandemic that was disastrous. A year ago, we were unable, Americans were unable to travel anywhere because we were one of the countries with the highest COVID toll. And it was so evident that we no longer could effectively tackle one of the biggest challenges, certainly in my lifetime. But I do think the country as a whole has shifted away from the model of American leadership that President Biden is familiar with as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and as really a major foreign policy player for decades, that he's used to. And I think this actually started under President Obama, even before President Trump, where this notion that we were going to automatically be the leader, that what some would have said we were the global policeman, that's never been as true as our critics have asserted, but that of course we had to be there. It's President Obama who, in the Middle East, for instance, in the Syrian crisis, in his attitude toward bringing troops home and ending forever wars, was already starting to say, this can't be America's burden alone. America has tremendous issues at home. We are going to pull back. Now, President Obama was a deeply committed multilateralist, and he wanted to work with partners, but he wasn't always willing to pay that price or bear any burden in a traditional multilateralist post-war tradition. And Trump, of course, exacerbated that radically. But I think Biden is going to have a hard time leading the United States back to the kind of position we assumed we enjoyed in the Cold War in the 1990s and even the aughts.
And that's a good jumping off point for us to come back to our audience quickly with the final question we have for you. We just want to see where you stand on this. And the question is simply, has America's standing in the world diminished in recent years? The first A is yes and B is no. So pretty straightforward. Has America's standing diminished? And once again, look at the chat function on your laptop, your desktop, or your device to answer it, and we'll give you those answers in just a moment. But Anne Marie, that brings me back to you, because how do you see this? I mean, you've talked about what President Biden's challenges are, but how much has America been diminished, if it has, in the eyes of the world under former President Trump?
I think we have definitely been diminished in the eyes of the world. But again, I'd trace that back both to the Iraq War and the 2008 financial crisis. I mean, we were really low in public opinion in Europe and many of our other allies before Barack Obama's election. Obama's election raised that, and we were living our values. We'd elected an African-American president. There was this wonderful boom in 2009 globally, but at the same time, the Chinese never looked at us the same way again after the financial crisis. And for many other countries, our brand of capitalism was deeply damaged. Again, President Trump thumbed his nose deliberately at the world and in many ways showed the ugliest side of the United States. And of course, in sowing the political division that he very deliberately did, that was again playing into the hands of many of those who would say, look at the great United States, look, they are tearing each other apart, their government is paralyzed. And then again, COVID. There's no question that many of my friends abroad, but just governments saying, no, Americans can't travel because Americans are really a poster child for how not to handle pandemic. George Packer has a new book out, and he writes that the dominant international attitude toward the United States during 2020 was pity, which is not something that I have ever thought I'd encounter. You know, we've handled the vaccine far better. The Biden administration is mounting a tremendous domestic agenda. And I do think the fact that they were able to get a minimum global corporate tax through the G7 shows real leadership again. So I think we're on the upswing, but we've been diminished, and some of that is not. I don't think Joe Biden can turn that around, no matter what his domestic agenda.
And as you rightly point out, Anne Marie, it's something that began before President Trump. You can argue it was made worse during the last 4 years, but it was already in the air. It was reality before that. Just picking up on what you were saying, we know that from day one, President Biden committed the U.S. to the Paris Accord when it came to climate, revived support for the World Health Organization, tried to reassure our transatlantic partners that America can be a trusted ally again. But the question is, are the allies buying it? We have now a comment we want to share with you from the former German ambassador to the United States, Wolfgang Ischinger.
For 5, 6, almost 7 decades, European decision makers, the European elite, had a good reason to believe that America was going to be present in Europe, was a European power, and would continue to extend its protective umbrella, security umbrella, nuclear umbrella over Europe. And this would go on forever. The 4 years of the Trump administration have, of course, created significant doubt. And this doubt is not going to go away completely because Europeans are not dumb, So we'll have this honeymoon with President Biden. Do we have a guarantee that 4 years from now, the American voter may not vote into office someone like Donald Trump again, and then we would be back to square one, maybe without the climate deal, without the Iran deal, without our joint security activities, etc. In other words, there is an element of doubting the reliability of the American ally.
So Anne Marie, that's the former German ambassador to the United States. What is your answer to him? Can the allies count on America?
Yes, in the sense that NATO is still plenty strong. And honestly, for all Trump's bluster, he did not ever try to pull out, and he emphasized that Europeans had to spend up to 2% of their GDP. A lot of what he actually said is quite similar to what Obama said and Biden will say. So in the immediate sense, we are in Europe, we're staying in Europe. The longer term trend, though, I think Ischinger is right, that if you look at Americans who do not remember World War II, who do not have grandparents who remember World War II, my generation, was still deeply marked by the stories of World War II. And an America that is going to be a plurality America. We will not have a white majority. And our pluralities, the largest plurality, will not come from Europe. It will go, white Americans will be the largest plurality, but after that, you're talking about Latinx Americans, Asian Americans of different kinds, African Americans, the sort of reflexive tie to Europe that European Americans and the experience of the 20th century fighting 2 wars in Europe cemented, and thus our alliances are built around, that is likely to weaken. And again, it was President Obama who executed the pivot to Asia. President Biden has a czar for Asia and a czar for the Middle East in his White House. He does not yet have an ambassador to NATO or to the European Union.
Good to be reminded of that. And before I come to you, Ian, on this question of whether the United States has a trust issue, I want to quickly report the results of our latest poll. We asked you in the audience if you think America's standing in the world has been diminished in recent years. 90% of you said yes. Only 10% said no. So there seems to be broad agreement about that. But Ian, on this question of trust and whether the allies, the rest of the world can count on the United States, what's the answer?
It's interesting. We haven't talked much about American power. And American power is, in my view, undiminished. In fact, vis-a-vis the allies, it's probably stronger. We're in a better technology position today than we were a couple of years ago, in part on the back of coronavirus. It's the vaccines, but it's also all of the tech companies that are doing vastly better right now, when the Europeans, the Japanese, the Canadians are very, very far behind. With the largest military in the world by far, the largest economy, and the US dollar is the global reserve currency, the energy position we're in. I mean, I can keep going, right? But soft power and the idea that the US is the political system that people count on or would want to model their behavior on, nobody buys that anymore. That was true even before January 6th and after January 6th. My God. I mean, the idea the Canadians, the Japanese, others would look at the US and say, I want my political system to run like that. That's crazy. And that's happening in the context where China is growing in power and growing in confidence. And so the global environment, we don't have a global free market anymore. We have a hybrid global economy. We're the second most powerful economy in the world, probably will be first in the next 10 years, is not a free market economy. It's a state capitalist economy run by an authoritarian regime. We can't say that the world is heading towards democracy anymore. It's becoming more illiberal by dribs and drabs every year while China is getting more powerful. We can't even say there's a World Wide Web. There's a splinter net. The largest data set in the world is separate from that of the West. It's China, and the G7 allies are trying to deal with that and coordinate, but that's the reality. And so at the same time that you have American power still strong, the global environment looks so very different, and the trust issue makes it much harder for American leadership to articulate itself in ways that, as Anne Marie said so very well, back when Joe Biden was running the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, American power may have looked the same, but I mean, the reality of American leadership was radically different.
Well, while we're talking about challenges for the United States, let's talk about another one. And Donna, I'm going to come to you for this one. We know that there are a number of domestic issues in this country that became issues internationally. And I'm thinking right now about what happened in May of 2020, the murder of George Floyd, not just the reaction here in the US, but around the world. We saw and we still see the Chinese, the Russian, even Iranian leaders calling out what they say is American hypocrisy on race and on human rights and civil rights. Do you see, or let me just say, how do you see race as a foreign policy issue?
Well, Judy, thank you for the question. I think that there has to be a recognition that what happens on the streets of America, as in what happened with the murder of George Floyd, January 6th, the insurrection, America broadcasts, if you will, to the rest of the world, and it sends signals. I think the interesting thing about the aftermath of the marches regarding George Floyd's murder was how that rippled across the world, but it also rippled in part because some of those nations, the UK, France, Germany, are experiencing actually the same things, particularly with their immigrant communities. And so there was a resonance across the world empathizing with those people who are marching for justice. Do we have to deal with those issues? Absolutely, because we need to domestically, but also because we have to demonstrate to the world that we operate under a system of justice. You know, I look at what's happening around the world as this sort of closing in on of democracies, where you have increased challenges from the right, not just in the United States, but around the world, to democracy. And that part of the responsibility that I think Joe Biden has right now is to allay the skepticism, but also to demonstrate, in fact, that we're dealing with the question of democracy to make it not so fragile here in the United States. And I don't think that that's an easy challenge to present to the world.
Well, we have seen, of course, the Biden administration make proposals with regard to criminal justice, police reform, but what are some steps you'd like to see the Biden administration take?
Well, you know what? I think we have to be more, the Biden administration actually has to be more aggressive in terms of enforcing civil rights violations across the country, really leaning on police departments to make sure that they comply with our civil rights law, reinstating some of the impositions of oversight into those law enforcement departments. But we got to pass something in the Congress, and we can't let other Democrats or Republicans stand in the way of that, because I think that, you know, if you are a young Black person, I'm the mother of one, you know, on any street in America, you want to know that your government is going to protect you, and that law enforcement, that police officers aren't going to do you harm. And that can't happen if the Congress of the United States and the President of the United States don't act. And we will see many more marches and demonstrations if that does not happen.
And continuing on this, Anne Marie, you've been doing a good bit of writing and thinking about the role of race in foreign policy lately. Share some of that with us.
Well, I think that you can't declare a fundamental commitment to racial equity domestically, as this president has done, and then have that stop at the water's edge. And I agree with Donna in terms of the example that we show the world. In many ways, those protests were the most effective example of American soft power we saw in the 4 years of the Trump administration, in the sense that people saw Americans standing up for their values, and many imitated and many supported. But I'll take an example with a vaccine. You know, and we now have a global vaccine program. It still falls far short, a pledge for 1 billion vaccines globally when we need 11 billion. But initially, the Biden administration was really playing vaccine nationalism. It was making deals with Japan and India to distribute vaccines to compete with China. Now, from a racial equity point of view, that just doesn't work. From a racial equity point of view, the United States should be standing for vaccinating the world, regardless of whether a particular country is more in China's camp or in our camp. That because so many people in the United States who are concerned with racial equity see that as a racial equity issue. And more broadly, they come at many issues from the jargon is a post-colonial perspective. But what that means is that if you come from a country, if your family comes from a country in Africa or Asia that was colonized by the United States or by one of our European allies, you may well have a different view about what is owed and how we think about the different issues. And you saw this with the Israeli-Palestinian most recent conflict. You saw the progressive left in the United States saying you cannot say Black lives matter and Palestinian lives don't. And that's just the beginning, I think, of the wave of young Americans who are much more aware of racial issues, certainly than my generation was, then looking out at the world and drawing a straight line as I said, between racial equity at home and racial equity abroad. And as we become ever closer to that pluralist country, you will see more and more of this.
And Ian, I don't think it's an understatement to say that the George Floyd death has just had a seismic effect on so many, if not all, foreign policy right now.
Well, it certainly did lead to very significant demonstrations around the world in dealing with their own racial issues. I mean, as Anne-Marie said, the United States did touch off a number of populist governments that were also in power on the back of the same sense of resentment and anti-establishment sentiment, but also a whole bunch of calls for racial justice and equity. We saw in the Netherlands, we saw in the UK, we saw, sort of in countries in Latin America, we saw in Brazil, countries all over the world. We're not the only ones dealing with racism, but America's media, America's public intellectuals, America's heft and power means that our problems and issues play out on a global stage. And we have to be aware of that. And we have to be somewhat responsible for that. And of course, that is something that a lot of our political leaders have had a hard time with.
And what are you saying? I mean, are you saying be careful, be responsible? What does that mean?
Well, being responsible, I mean, Anne-Marie has a point on Israel and Palestine. I mean, how does the United States, sort of put itself up as the exceptionalist power when we're obviously not an honest broker on Israel and Palestine? Israel is the top ally of the United States. That was true under Trump. It was true under Obama. It's true under Biden. The interests of the United States in actually ensuring that the Palestinians are treated as human beings Anthony Blinken gives rhetorical service to that. And I think he believes it in his heart. Anne-Marie and I both know him very well. But it's not going to lead to any significance in terms of effectual policy on the ground. How about Yemen? How about, sort of the Northern Triangle? How about, sort of Venezuela and refugees into Colombia? I mean, a lot of this is less our problem because it's less our problem. And I think that this is going to be, this is why America First resonated with so many people, is because the average American said, you guys are just taking care of the elites. You're forgetting about me. And why the hell would I support, dues for the United Nations or all sorts of foreign aid and relief in the United States truly acting like a global leader that understands that all human beings are truly all human beings? Why would I do that when you don't care about my community, about my family, when life expectancy for the average white male was going down in the US while it was heading up to over 70 for the world over the past decade? The United States, it wasn't. So this fundamentally, even though we can make these arguments that we know what the solutions are for the richest, most powerful country in the world to make a difference that would make the world more sustainable as it's becoming less so, if you don't take care of the average Americans, if you're not seen to taking care of the average Americans, we're just not going to care. We won't support it. And many of our political elected officials will take advantage of that for their own political gain. And I think you've seen those challenges play out in every issue we've discussed through this show today.
And I want to get Donna to respond to that, and Anne-Marie too. Anne-Marie, he's thrown down the gauntlet on a number of things. What would you pick out?
Well, I agree with Ian in the sense that for at least a decade, I mean, back to 2008 and before, the best thing the United States could do for our standing abroad is to fix our problems at home. And I mean, our big problems, the state of our infrastructure, if you are used to, other wealthy countries, is an embarrassment. The state of our educational system is an embarrassment, including higher ed. I mean, we have jewels, right? We have absolute jewels of universities. But if you look at the amount of student debt and the number of students who graduate and then can't get a job and still have to pay back debt, the state of our health system, which we are more and more Americans are being able to compare it to neighboring countries, not just on COVID, but just on drug prices, on the insane prices we pay for so many procedures. Those issues are things that other countries see. the inequality of our capitalism. I mean, I take Ian's point about our tech companies are thriving, but for so many Americans and so many people looking around the world, that means we've added another 100 billionaires, and yet we can't pass a decent minimum wage. So I really do think it is up to us to focus on how we once again renew the best of us and how we can actually fix our domestic problems. I'm not saying we withdraw from the world. I think Biden is right to be once again playing a key role within multilateral fora, but I don't think this is the moment to announce to the American people that our great projects are global, they're domestic. To the extent climate and health are both, and those should both be privileged.
And on that provocative note, I'm going to thank Anne-Marie Slaughter for joining us. It's so very good to see you, and we appreciate you being with us so much. And we have about 4.5 minutes left for our co-hosts, Ian and Donna, to give us their closing thoughts. Donna, why don't you begin? What are you taking away as you've just listened to Anne-Marie and as you reflect on this 90 minutes?
Well, thank you, Judy, and what a provocative conversation. I think that Anne-Marie is right in the sense that because the United States projects so broadly around the world, that so many of the issues that divide Americans are seen and they're used as part of that whataboutism. And so if we want to put a plug in that, then we've got to fix some of our toughest problems. And they are not, and many of them don't have easy solutions, and especially not easy political solutions. This question around equity spans the spectrum from climate to where it is that you invest in your infrastructure, to who gets those jobs, to how you raise wages and create people who have the ability to climb into the middle class. How it is that all of us can experience justice. And to the extent that we project democracy, then we got to make our democracy work. And when you have half of the country that is still questioning an election that's been put to bed for real, that becomes a real challenge around the world. And so I think it's important for us to project leadership around the world as President Biden is doing, but we must really concentrate on how it is that we bring up the standard of living for most Americans, and to do that in a way that we can project to the rest of the world that we really are back.
And final word for you, Ian, reminding, listening to Donna, listening to Anne-Marie, that our theme today is foreign policy and how it affects all of us Americans. Ian.
Judy, I don't think that we can say America is back until Americans feel like they're back. And given what we've experienced over the past year and a half, and for so many Americans over the past decades, that's not the work of just one administration. We can start it. And I think what we saw at G7 was an honest effort to begin, but it's going to take a very long time, and some humility about that, I think, would be useful for all of us.
Ian Bremmer, Donna Edwards, thank you both. Thank you to all of our brilliant guests for your provocative contributions. We so appreciate it. That does it for this program with GZERO, its media live stream. I'm Judy Woodruff. It's been such a privilege to join you. I want to thank everybody who's been watching and listening and participating in our interactive feature, for casting your votes. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.